Can you see with my big head? No, you're good.
Welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Vicki Saunders and I'm going to be your moderator this evening. And we'll do more in-depth introductions of our panel in just a minute. But I wanted to get started with a moment of mindfulness. If you've done the Innerwork Center program before, we'd like to just give you an opportunity to get fully present and center yourself. So find a comfortable position in your chairs. Perhaps your feet are grounded. Perhaps your hands are resting comfortably in your lap. And if you're comfortable, soften your gaze, but don't do it till you get to your seat. Close your eyes. And let's just take a couple of deep breaths together at your own pace. Maybe breathing in through your nose. Hold for a second. And a slow exhale. And do this a couple times at your own pace, allowing yourself to become fully present. You might soften the muscles in your face, relax your shoulders, feel the rise and fall of your belly, and open yourself to learning and exploration. And also allow yourself to share the gratitude that I have for the Innerwork Center and for Yetta and Felicia and Sarah and all the wonderful work they did to put this together. So we're looking forward to a wisdom-filled evening. So when you're ready, on your next exhale, open your eyes, look at your fingers, your toes, roll your shoulders, and let's get started. I wanted to start with it, since our theme tonight is inner work across all these interesting, fascinating traditions. I wanted to start with a definition of inner work. Struggled with it for a little while. It became clear to me why we as an organization have trouble talking about what we do. So I thought I'd put the task in your hands. I'd like to go around the room and just ask you to check in with one word that comes to mind for you when you think of inner work. Just one word. Which one is that?
Sure. Excited.
Awesome. So let me say too, if you hear your word, don't change it, because if we hear the same word over and over again, that's data. So, please.
Soul.
Soul.
Deep.
Deep.
Gratitude.
Gratitude. Thank you. Peaceful. Peaceful.
Togetherness.
Togetherness. Health.
Curiosity.
Wisdom. Yes. Curiosity. Aubrey.
Spaciousness.
Nice. Jan. Growth.
Time.
That's a good one. Rudy.
Kindness.
I love it. Thank you. Back here.
Community.
I like it. Thank you. Grounding. Grounding. Okay. I forgot. Yeah. Compassion. Compassion. Awesome. Thank you. Allison? Equanimity.
Exploring.
Sharon?
Joy.
Robert? Medicine. Got it. Peace. Yeah. Joy. Joy. Alive. Felicia, I skipped over side. Ease. Love it. Quality. And unity. Unity. Cooperative. And unity. Oh, I'm sorry.
Spirituality.
Spirituality. Love it.
Deepening.
See, all the best answers are right here in the room. Did I miss anybody? Chris?
Mystery.
Mystery. Awesome. not check in with mine. Mine is wholeness. So that's how I think about it. I thought too, I would share with you the definition from our website, just because it's pretty darn good. Inner work is the essential practice of fostering personal development through self-awareness and growth. At its core, inner work helps individuals cultivate a deep-seated security from within, building confidence and empowering them to live more joyously and extend kindness, compassion, and a genuine sense of connection to self and others. There's a little bit more I'm going to say for the end. But we heard a lot of those words already, so we have some common themes. I'm going to ask our panelists now to introduce themselves, and they're going to share with you their name, the tradition that they represent, and one guiding principle of inner work for their tradition. Emily,
I realize now I'm the one who's going first. My name is Emily Wilmer. I'm the rector at St. John's Episcopal Church in Churchill. It's the oldest church. It was the only church in Richmond for a while. It descends from the Church of England, and after the Revolutionary War became the Episcopal Church. And that's part of the Anglican tradition. And I would say, I begin this by saying that we believe, I think all of us believe, that God or the divine or the source of all being is love. God is love. So a guiding principle in our tradition is presence to that love. Being deeply aware of God's presence within us, with others, and within the world around us. So practicing the presence of God lies at the heart of what you call spiritual self-reflection and growth.
Yeah, so my name is Danny. I'm here, I guess I'm here representing Judaism, but I always feel uncomfortable saying that because if you know anything about Judaism, really I'm here representing one particular, not even denomination, but my own idiosyncratic version of Judaism, because if you've heard the saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So I just need to give that disclaimer. But in addition to agreeing with everything that was just said, one thing that I've been thinking about in preparation for this conversation is what I do think of as a very Jewish idea, that there's not actually a clear distinction between inner work and outer work. What is inner necessarily has ramifications outwards. And in fact, that distinction doesn't really exist between those 2 categories in the first place. Yeah.
Amal?
Hi. Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. My name is Amal, which means hope in Arabic, and I represent the Muslim tradition. Inner work in my faith, if I had to answer the question that Vicky asked at the beginning, my word would be sincerity. And later on I'll tell you a little story about that. But that's the word I would use. But all the words that I heard were so beautiful and so true. So it's more than one word.
And let me apologize to my panel for not letting you check in with your one word. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Archana Pathak, and I am a practicing Hindu. Similar to what you said, Danny, Hinduism is a web of philosophies with a widely diverse way of approaching it. So we don't talk about a singular kind of articulation of Hinduism. But what I will say is for Hinduism, when we talk about inner work, we're talking about the self, and for us, the self is described as the relationship between Brahman and Atman, Brahman being the God source, and Atman being the self source. And what is that relationship?
Yeah, so I'm Jay Anderson, and I guess I'm going to be the one speaking from the perspective of Buddhism, and like everybody else, that covers a lot of territory. Supposedly, the Buddha said that all that he taught was suffering and the relief of suffering. But that's not helpful. I mean, those are just words. Great. So maybe something like understanding reality and then aligning your actions, beliefs, and intentions accordingly. I guess is the thing that would consistent with all the traditions.
Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to start with a couple questions for the panelists, and then we'll open up for questions for you to ask the group. So be thinking as we talk what questions you might have. I found that the richness of these programs really comes from your questions, not from us blabbering. But we'll blabber a little bit. So the first question I have is, how does your faith define inner work or spiritual self-reflection? And I wanted to pick up on Danny's comment as well, if I could, about the distinction between inner and outer work. I hadn't really thought about that much, and I'm wondering if in your tradition, if there is a hard and fast line between inner and outer work, or do they blend together, or how are they connected? So if you have some definitions that are germane to your tradition, let's start there, and then carry on about whether there's a distinction between inner and outer. I don't want to make Amelie go first. Archana, can I pick on you?
Yes, sure. So I'm going to answer the second question first.
Of course.
And so for Hinduism, ultimately all work is done to achieve moksha. And moksha is the release from the cycle of life and death, of birth and death, right? But we do have clear distinctions of inner work and outer work, but all of them are seen as paths towards moksha. So for example, a practice of outer work might be what's called bhakti yoga, and the word yoga is misused in the United States. It literally means the way. So the way to moksha is what yoga is, but we refer specifically to the physical one of all of those. So prana yoga is the yoga of breath, the way of breath to release our release. So bhakti yoga is worship. So and bhakti yogis are those who have a love affair with God. So an example of bhakti yoga from the Hindu tradition is Mirabai. Mirabai had such a deep and profound love for Lord Krishna. It was a romanticized love, and she just, all she did was like think about him and prepare for him and plan to see him and worship him. And so that led her to release from being born again over and over again because she had that. So that's an outer work kind. It is seen as an outer work practice, and people with bhakti yoga are deeply attentive to their temples and the temples we have in our homes, etc. Inner work then is, I would say, Atma Vinyan, which is considered the kind of realization of who we are and that our true essence is eternal and unchanging. And so Atma means soul. Or it actually, I'm going to back up here. It actually means self, not just the soul, but self. And what is that relationship of this self with the divine self, right? Brahma and Atma. So Brahma is the divine self, Atma is the individual self, and to get to a point where you recognize that there is no distinction between the two, right? And so our goal is to see the connection between the ultimate unchanging reality, which is Brahman, right? And we do that, if we can do that, we achieve moksha, which is the liberation from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, right? That we go through, and the only way to get there is to have that self-knowledge and realization of oneself with Brahman. And I could talk more about like the practices of that. I think we're going to get to that.
Perfect. Amal, can you speak to how the definition of inner work?
Okay.
So in Islam we have this guiding principle that says, "Man arifa nafsahu faqad arifa rabbah," which means, translated in English, he who knows himself knows his Lord. So knowing the self is part of knowing God, the God that we worship. And inner work, of course, is a prerequisite for growth and change. There's a verse in the Quran that says, and it's chapter 13, verse 11, God does not change any people's condition unless they change their inner selves. So in order for God to help you in the change that you're seeking, you have to start by changing your inner self, and then the help of God will come. So like relying on God to change you is not what we are supposed to be doing. So when I talked about the word that defines inner work for me was sincerity, the reason being is because of a very important principle in Islam, which is summarized by hadith. Hadith is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he just simply said, actions are judged by intentions. So your action is to be judged according to your intention. And he gave a very nice little story. He said that like many years before he became prophet, I mean, like, this is a story from history, from the past, there was a man, and this man lived an evil life. He did all sorts of wrong things, and among those things, he killed 99 people. He had killed 99 people. And then one day he realized he didn't want to continue living like that. He wanted to become a good person. So he didn't know how to become a good person. So he started going around and asking people, how can I change? How can I become a good person? And nobody knew the answer. Then somebody told him, there's a monk over there, why don't you go and ask him? He's a wise man. So he goes to the monk and he says, I have killed 99 people, but I don't want to continue like this. I want to change. What can I do to change? The monk looks at him and says, you've killed 99 people? There's no way you can change. So he kills him and makes 100.
Oh!
So it doesn't end there. Then he continues his quest. He goes around saying to people, I have killed 100 people. I want to change. What can I do to change? And so eventually he comes to a person who tells him, you need to go to the top of that mountain. There's a hermit there. Ask him. He's got a lot of knowledge and wisdom. So he goes to the top of the mountain and he asks he tells the story to the hermit. And the hermit looks at him and he says, where do you come from? And he says, from such and such city. He says, I know what your problem is. Your problem is that you come from a city where all the people are bad. They're very evil people. You need to go to another city in order to be able to change. So he tells him the name of another city, and he says, travel to that city. Once you reach there, you'll be able to change. So he thanks the hermit. He doesn't kill him. And he says, on this journey towards the city, which is supposed to help him change. And on his way, he dies, like in the middle of his journey, he dies. And then the angels of mercy and the angels of torment come down, and each one wants to claim his soul. And they start arguing amongst each other. The angels of mercy say, well, he was on his way to change his life, so we caught him. And the angels of torment say, well, he had never done anything good in his life. He killed 100 people, so we've got him. So then they ask God to judge, like who should be taking him. So God says, measure the distance between him and the good city and the bad city, and whichever distance is closer, then he's on that side. So they start measuring, and God makes the distance between him and his destination, the good city, he makes it shrink, and so the angels of mercy take him. So his intention saved him, basically. So that's the story, but So sincerity and honesty is very important in our tradition. In order to start doing this inner work, you have to be honest about yourself, about your shortcomings. He knew he was not doing good things. He knew he had killed 99 people or 100 people, and that was wrong. So he wanted to change. So it starts by wanting to do that change, even though it's difficult. And we have 3 pillars of inner work in Islam. And the first one is called tafakkur, and I'll translate what it is. The second one is called muraqaba, and the third one is called muhasaba. So tafakkur is basically deep meditation. It's thinking about the universe, the world around you, and how God created it, and the marvels of creation, and just witnessing the awesomeness of God and marveling at it. So that's the first part. And you know, of course, when you do that, you realize how insignificant you are compared to all of that. And the second one is muraqaba. Muraqaba means watchfulness, meaning that we are always cognizant of the fact that God is watching us at every minute, every second of our lives. There's nothing we can do that is not being witnessed by God. And then the third one is muhasaba, which is accountability. So accountability is holding yourself accountable for things. And I don't know how much time I have, but
You know, why don't we hold there
Yeah,
and
okay.
get the others
Yeah,
in
sure.
the definition, because we want to go to the practices next. So, Jay, can we jump over to you? Do you have some definitions in Buddhism for inner work?
Sure. The Dan, yeah. What he said about there not being a hard distinction between external and inner work is especially true for Buddhism as well. And I think most folks are familiar with the more what might stereotypically be understood is the inner work of Buddhism, like meditation, and mindfulness, or zazen, or if you're familiar with the Pure Land teachings, chanting the Nembutsu. But the role of ethics that cut across Buddhism is often not highlighted enough, and I think is actually the more central aspect of the inner work is. So one of the first teachings that the Buddha always teaches was dana, or generosity, because nothing that can deflate the ego as much as giving away what you have. So that's true for the lay people, but then for the monastics, they have to beg for it, and nothing deflates the ego like having to ask for your survival. So everything, the ethics, you get your actions right to get yourself out of the way so that you can see clearly. But the more you see clearly, the more yourself will get out of the way, and the more of our interactions will be. So I think that's a true
Yep,
version
that's good.
of what I was saying.
Danny, can you talk about their definitions of inner work in the Jewish tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this, and I think there are a lot of different ways to answer that question. What I want to offer is a teaching from Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapiro, who was an important early 20th century Polish Jewish mystic. And what he says quite explicitly is that the goal of Jewish ritual practice is to transform yourself into a prophet. And what does that mean? You know, because we have in our culture this idea often that prophets are people who see the future, or you know, get messages in this kind of, I think, often narrow way. But really, it makes me think of Abraham Joshua Heschel's writing about prophets and prophecy. So Heschel says that a prophet is a person who holds God and humanity in the same thought at the same time. He goes even further and says that a prophet is somebody who is able to step into God's consciousness of what the world is. And we could spend, hours just talking about what that means, but
Take a breath on that one.
yeah. But I do think ultimately there's really something to that Judaism believes that, I guess you could think of it as a state of total awareness of divinity. An awareness of the world as a home for divinity that is so total that it is actually not distinct from God's awareness itself, is attainable by us. And that's what really we are striving for. I guess I'll share one quick parable, which comes to us from 18th century Ukrainian Jewish mysticism, which is that there's a king who lives in a fortress surrounded by guards and moats and, imagine whatever the king's surrounded by, right? And people come to try to meet the king. And some people get further and further in and give up. And eventually somebody comes into the inner sanctum of the palace and is able to meet the king. And when they do, they realize that all of the obstacles that kept them from the king were illusions. That there was no obstacle between them and the king at all. And I think that's another way maybe to think about this state of prophecy. This realization that the obstacles you perceive between yourself and divinity, that one's relatively easy, but that guy and divinity, those obstacles are all illusory. And these are very easy ideas to talk about, but to actually embody, live day in, day out is very challenging. But ultimately, I think that's the inner work that is simultaneously outer work that Judaism calls us to do.
Well, I love what you just said, and I'm going to dovetail on from Howard Thurman, sort of this shamanistic function, and his idea was that the prophet, the goal is not just to bring the prophetic message of truth from God to the religious community, but lead individuals and community to have the experience of the divine from which they may gain wholeness themselves. So rather than be that prophetic voice, our goal is to be led or lead others to be able to hear that voice for ourselves. And so I love what you said about seeing as God sees or hearing. So anyway, I just thought I would make that connection. The standard line is that inner work really is to achieve union with God and participation with God, so that we then are aligned with God's work, with God's vision, God's seeing, everything that God beholds. And so my sense is that anything that as with Buddha that gets in the way of that, we want to be liberated from that. And so Christianity has taken this and run with it in so many different ways. The Anglican tradition really focuses much more on spiritual practices that enable us to align ourselves with the presence, the will, the love of God. And those include things like prayer and contemplation, other forms of activity, but also this idea that we're not just transformed from the inside out, but also from the outside in. So practicing the presence of God is also engaging in acts of compassion, generosity. Those things transform the inside from the outside.
There's an
Intention. So I think that the teacher we follow is Jesus, and so our imitating his life is a way of achieving that union as well, which is acts of compassion, embracing those who are overlooked, the last, the least, the lost, and being in solidarity. And that there's a lot that goes on in our inner life, but there's also a very long strand of mysticism in Christianity, which
I didn't pick up on that.
Okay.
I'm gonna interrupt you.
Okay.
Well, because I'm going to go off script, so get ready. They didn't know about this question. But I'm just hearing this notion of mysticism in all of the traditions, either directly referred to or indirectly. So I'm curious, how you see that element in your tradition and how it's connected to inner work. So I'll let you start.
I understand mysticism as a direct experience of the divine versus knowledge about the divine.
Okay.
And we have strands of Christianity that are all about you're saved if you know or believe these things. Other strands are you are transformed through direct experience of union and communion with the divine.
So a mystic
That's a
experience.
mystic experience. And so I would say that the Anglican tradition has tended more, at least in my own experience, toward embracing the mystical elements of our tradition. But not all. Just like all of you, we are just a mixed bag, and we don't agree, and it's really hard right now. I'm going to keep my mouth shut as much as I can. There's a very vocal minority.
This is a safe space.
Yes, a very vocal minority of Christianity that's very much, in or out, right or wrong, black and white, and there's a deep tradition of a fluid, non-dogmatic, non-dualistic strain of Christianity, and I believe that's what our teacher embodied. So I'm going to calm down and pass this on. Mysticism.
Danny, can you pick up on mysticism in the Jewish tradition?
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, normative Judaism is essentially mystical. I think, the canonical texts of Judaism are mystical texts. If you look at going back to the Bible, right? The revelation of Mount Sinai, this description in the biblical text, all of the entire nation of Israel is gathered at the foot of the mountain, and all of the people see the sounds of this revelation happening. I don't know how to understand that except as a communal, mass, mystical experience. And, if you go to a traditional synagogue service 3 times a week, there's a reading from the Torah, ritually chanted, and that's understood not just as a kind of, as a reading or a gesture, but as an actual reenactment of that revelation. And so, I think if you take that seriously, you can't not be, at the very least, open to what we would consider mysticism.
Amal, can you speak about it?
So in Islam, there's a very strong mystical tradition called Sufism, and there's many branches of Sufism. The goal, of course, ultimate goal is to get closer to God. That you actually, there's this concept of fana, which is a little bit like nirvana, like you. I don't know much about nirvana, but I think it's probably a little bit similar, that you feel you're in the existence of God, and you basically forget about yourself, you forget about the universe that's around you. It's just God takes over everything. And I have some friends who are follow Sufi tradition. It's hard work, actually. They have to do so many things.
So there's a lot of ritual involved.
Not ritual, but a lot of prayers and remembrance, and they also have to train themselves to do things, like they have to work on their character, make their character better. So it's a lot of inner work as well, in order to, because only the worthy get closer to God. Like it's not just, of course your intention is good, it has to be good, the right intention, but you have to be worthy of getting closer and closer and closer. So I'm honestly, I'm not a Sufi, I'm just a regular Muslim.
The plain vanilla kind.
I tried calling a friend who's a Sufi last night, but she didn't answer my call.
She was interesting.
I was going to share
She was working on her character.
Yeah.
Can you speak to mysticism?
So I think this question of mysticism is interesting to me. I'm not quite sure how one would define it. I mean, I think that in Hinduism there is talk about, I would use the word chamatkar, like this miracle or kind of thing that gets done. And there's, of course, a lot of stories where polytheistic, we have stories about fathers killing sons, pissing their wives off, and then putting an elephant head on the body of their child to calm the wife down. So, we've got mysticism. I'm not going to say that. Which, by the way, is the story of Lord Ganesh and how he becomes the elephant god. But I'm also going to say that I think the mystical note, I think the notion of mysticism is at the core of Hinduism through Om.
So say a little more about that.
Just to say Om, to pronounce it correctly and to hit that right vibration is in itself a mystical experience.
So something happens in the body.
It literally, the resonance transforms the body, it transforms the space and everything. But I think one of the things, and I don't think this is different than any of the other traditions, but one thing I will say is the language in which we talk about this is we do not talk about getting closer to God. We talk about realizing that we have falsely created the distance between Atma and Brahma. So life is Maya, attachment and illusion. So everything is an illusion. And so when we are able to see through illusion is when we hit moksha. So when I tell, growing up as a child, saying to my father, something horrible has happened, right? Something horrible at school, something terrible at work, the loss of a family member, whatever, and I would be heartbroken. And my father would say to me, Abhimayate, this too is attachment. Abhililate, this too is the dance of life. Krishna danced the dance of life. And when we see through the dance, it gets us to, so sometimes dancing the dance of life gets us to moksha. Right? So I think that framing is something that is maybe distinct to Hinduism, in which we never talk about figuring out how to get closer to God. We talk about figuring out how to get back to where from that which we came. It's just that when we take birth, we lose, we forget, we have attachment. Right? So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it to the audience next, so get your questions ready.
That's helpful because Buddhism is an offshoot of the same thing, Dharma. And so it arose along with a bunch of other heterodox and orthodox schools like yoga and Jainism, Gangetic playing in the 500 BCE. It would have a different understanding of mysticism as well, and so when I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to be using it in a much different sense, where the mystical aspects of Buddhism, or that's like your superpowers, like the ability to have telepathy or to materialize things out of nowhere, or these like impressive CDs that you can develop by going into deep concentrated absorptions, or being able to walk on water. So that's mystical stuff. Yeah. And for Buddhism, at least from what I understand, most of Hindu practice is like, that's cool, but none of that is important. And even if you can do that stuff, you shouldn't, because it just gets in the way. What's more important is, again, getting back to how the world is, and just keep returning to the very mundane. Even if you sometimes have to go through some really unmundane stuff to get there, like tantric practices and visualizations and worshiping deities. and so forth. But don't get caught up in the really cool stuff, because that's just gonna get you away from the exact same goal of
It's a
moksha.
distraction.
Of moksha, which is how you guys are defining mysticism in a different way. But that's something that makes sense.
And I'll actually jump off of that. I think we would even go so far, Hinduism, and I think to some extent Buddhism would even go so far as to say, spiritual self-realization, right? Atman Gyan is made up of self-realization, self-knowledge, self-inquiry, and reflection. So that self-inquiry, knowing the limits of the body, learning what how can we have mind over matter. If you are doing all of that, so these yogis who do this kind of extreme stuff, right, in the Ganga Ghat, right? Like when they do that, they're doing that because they are taking themselves to that place of knowing the illusion of this body, right? And so it is, and so that kind of that mysticism can be a path too, Atman Gyan, right? But Gnan, which also means knowledge, is not the ego knowledge of look how smart I am, right? So I was really truly raised with people like when we would see that kind of stuff. My dad's so cool. My dad's like, I don't know. Like, don't get too caught up in that. Like, because you don't know if that person is like ego smart, right? Or they're like, look what I can do, or if they are truly having they're doing that spiritual work of self-inquiry. Oftentimes, like in the mundane, in the day-to-day, I was taught to see that in the common person, and not in these people who are like performers.
Set apart.
Does that make sense? But I want to be careful. I don't mean that doing that stuff is not considered a path, but the ones who like are making a buck off of it aren't necessarily the ones we're talking. And by that I mean
There are charlatans everywhere.
Yeah. So I guess stuff like that, and so So I guess I think that's also similar, right? Like you can do that stuff, but you're doing it because you're teaching yourself this relationship between Atma and the body, right?
So I think that's a good point. Good place to get you guys involved. Questions? Yes. Netta.
What do you mean?
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I guess for a Buddhist friend, I was reading a Pema Chodron book, and this was a long time ago. She's talking about non-theism versus, I guess, atheism. So, and I know there's a lot of, there's like Zen and Tibetan and Vipassana and all these different kind of branches of Buddhism, but there's no like belief of God or against God, or how would you frame that up? Easy question for you.
Oh, yes. So there's a few ways that were specifically addressed, and then because the Western understanding of God doesn't map well onto Eastern traditions, it's kind of weird. So in one sense, definitely believes in gods in the Hindu pantheon. In fact, the Buddha wasn't going to teach except Indra and Brahma begged him to. So they believe in all the deities, even Zen and some of the more austere ones, except as it's finding its feet in the West, because Buddhism is very good at adapting to cultural norms and specifics. So in the West, they tend to downplay that stuff, which I think is unfortunate. But anyway, that's. But they don't. There isn't. Well, some are going to say there isn't Brahman or an absolute source, or definitely not the Vaishnava conception or the Abrahamic conception of God. Probably is what they would say. Early Buddhism, what the Buddha said is not talking about that. Suffering and how to relieve suffering. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. Don't care. Suffering, that's a nonsense. Don't even worry about that. This and this. Let's get to business. But so A, they're agnostic about it. B, they're atheist, or C, they're like theists, all at the same time.
Woody, would you like to hear from the other traditions on that question, or?
Sure. I mean, my sense is that the other traditions have, there's less question in my mind about the sense that they
Yeah.
believe that there's a God, but and I know the concept of it is a problem, right? The concept of God is a problem per se, but yeah, if that question applies to everyone else.
I mean, I think the duality exists in Hinduism too, self and divine. And the point is that it's not, there's no gap, it's not a duality, and we just need to get through that. And we can tell a whole bunch of stories about a whole bunch of things, but there's no, in Hinduism, the argument is people think we have a lot of gods, and that's, again, the mapping, right? Like the mapping sucks. It just doesn't work. We don't. But we have our avatars, which is when the Supreme Being chooses to manifest in physical form such that we can then learn.
It's very incarnational, and there's some parallels to Christianity in that.
Right, but it's happened a lot, is the whole point. Like,
Many dimensions.
So, for example, there's a lot, like there's elements of Hinduism that's written about in which Jesus walked the land in the Ganges River area and was seen as an atta and is accepted as an atta. Right? Now, I'm going to also say one thing just to connect to something you said earlier. This is my personal belief. Every single religious practice can be and has been politicized.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And that often leads to very didactic identity politics. So I am positive there are people who would identify as Hindu who would say, I am wrong. That Ram was a person and that he walked on this earth and there were real physical locations where he was. Maybe, maybe not. Yes, and. Right, is where I'm going to go with that. So I want to point that because that kind of stuff happens in every. I don't think there is I'm not sure of a single religious tradition, at least out of the major world religions, that doesn't have that some history of the politicizing of and manipulation of the practice to then speak to identitarian politics. I don't think so.
Bob, did you want to speak to God?
Maybe
You know what I meant.
Maybe directly.
And then tell us about it.
So I'll just speak from personal experience. I was born and raised in supposedly a Muslim family, but my parents were not practicing at all. Like, they never taught me anything religious. I remember when I was in like pre-K or KG, I heard my friends at school saying, oh, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim, I'm this, I'm that. And I went home and I asked my mom, I said, Mom, all my friends are Christian and Muslim, what are we? And she said, we're Muslim. And that was that. She didn't explain what Muslim meant. And I had no idea. And then, but somehow, I don't remember how, I felt there was a God, and I felt connected to him, even as a child. I remember being 4 or 5 years old, going to bed and lying awake in bed, talking to God in my inside voice, like not actually moving my tongue, but with my thoughts, talking to God, and knowing that he can hear me. And I don't know where that came from. I honestly don't know where that came from. And so I had this connection as a child, and then I grew up, I became older, and in the pre-teen years, 11, 12, I started flirting a little bit with atheism and agnosticism. And I remember one time we had a discussion at school about God, and I said to my friends, why do you believe in God? Is it because your parents tell you to? And a Christian friend, I remember her, she was saying, shut up, you're committing blasphemy. And I was like, no, so anyway, I was questioning, and then at the age of 13, I found myself in a situation at school. It seemed like a big problem for me. Looking in retrospect, of course, it was not a huge problem, but at the time for me, as a teenager, it was a huge problem, and I didn't know how to solve it. And I found myself writing a letter to God and asking for His help. And I was just expressing my thoughts, and then I stopped myself and I said, what am I doing? I only turn to God when I need Him? This is not right. So then I added to the letter and I said, I am sorry that I only come to you when I need you, but I promise this time if you answer my request, I will never doubt you again. And it happened. My problem got mysteriously solved, and since that day I hope I kept my end of the bargain. I kept believing in God before I even found religion. And I didn't find religion until I was 15 or 16. But when I found religion and I slowly started to practice, I was reading a book one day and by a Muslim scholar, and he was saying God is independent of time and place. And I was like, how can God be like I just couldn't. I knew it was the truth, but I couldn't explain it. Like I couldn't fathom it in my mind, in my limited mind. So I prayed to God and I said, I know you're independent of time and place, but I don't know how. Can you please teach me how? And I kid you not, every time I ask God a question, the answer comes, maybe not right away, but it comes somehow. And I don't know how much later, few months later, I was reading a magazine and there was a book review, and the book review was about A Brief History of Time. Stephen Hawking. And I read the review and I was like, oh my God, I was actually reading it in bed because I had just woken up. And I rushed out, I put my clothes on and I rushed to the nearest bookstore and bought the book. And I was like, this is going to explain it to me. And although Stephen Hawking does not believe in God, he passed away now, God rest his soul, but it actually made sense. It made sense to me. It explained how God is independent of creation. I mean, he doesn't say that in the book, but this is how I interpreted it. And God is independent of everything. God is independent of time, of space, because He created time and space. God is very transcendent for us. We don't believe that He, walked the earth, materialized in the human body. We don't believe that. But for us, God is the ultimate goal. We want to be with God, and hopefully, if we are good enough to enter paradise, then the biggest reward in paradise is actually seeing the face of God. And the prophet said that when you see the face of God, you're not going to want anything else. And that's it. That's
Good place to let Danny and Emily weigh in. So if you have some reflections on God from the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, I guess I don't have so much more to add in this context to what I have already said in terms of the parable and stuff. But I will just say briefly that often I think that when we talk about God and belief in God, we, in our culture, are kind of participating in a conversation that's dominated by Protestant ways of thinking about these kind of binary categories of belief and disbelief. And Jews don't really talk about, like, if you were to go to Temple Bethel, you're not really going to hear people talking about their faith. Right? We don't, and so this is why I'm grateful for conversations like this with diverse traditions where we can get outside of that kind of what I think of as this Protestant framework of belief and into a framework of myth and practice and, these kinds of broader conversations. Yeah.
We have a story in Hinduism where there's a thief, a bad man, and he only thinks about like doing bad things. And so
Clean money.
Like killing other people.
and so someone's talking to him and they say, what do you believe in? And he says, I believe in violence. I say, okay. So the word for violence in my language is ma, to hit someone, M-A. And they said, sit down and chant. I was like, what do you mean? It's like, it's your belief. Honor it. Do it. And he says, ma, 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 ra, 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 ra. And the word flips and becomes ram. To truly investigate and know yourself, you'll find out. And so he just says, ma, 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 ram, 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 ram. Before he knows it, he has chanted the name of Ram, which is a manifestation of Hindu, of Vishnu, 1,000 times, and he achieves moksha. Right? So like this idea, like, and that I don't know how to explain, like, you know, I don't know how to explain that. I have, in my family, we do certain chanting, and we started doing it in the pandemic because we just wanted to have a way to be together, so we started doing it on Zoom. I have a family that lives, most of them live in the same town, and so they used to see each other all the time. And when the pandemic hit, they couldn't see each other all the time, and it really, I think, threw them. So they decided to get on Zoom, and for those in my family who believe, we believe that chanting the 40 verses of Lord Hanuman is can cure illness in the world, right? And so we believe in the vibration of good words, good deeds, etc. And so we decided to start doing Hanuman Jalisa on Saturday. It's the day of Hanuman, we'll do that. So some of my family is hard believers, and so they wanted to do it. But I have cousins who are atheists, straight up atheists, right? They we don't reference and say things about God with them, right? But they started doing it because out of respect for the family. That it's a chance to be with the family, and they learned how to do it, and they started saying it. Now, for us, that's cool. That's great, right? Now, what led that? Like, does that mean they believe? Like, we don't have it. Like, I'm not gonna have. I don't care if you believe. You can find release from attachment through so many paths. So, honoring your mother and father, right? So, my first gurus are my mom and dad, right? So, if I pray to my parents every day, that's moksha, right? My second guru is my guru, the person who teaches me about my spiritual being, right? We pray to Lord Hanuman because nobody prayed to Ram better than Hanumanji did. So I'm not good enough or steady enough to pray to Lord Ram, but I pray to Lord Hanuman because his steadiness will take me to that. So it's just such a different, like, this idea of, do I believe, do I not believe, is God here, is God not here? Like, these are not questions that I necessarily asked or have had answered.
Yes, it's not part of the tradition.
It's just not.
Did you have
And so I'm standing in the middle of Protestantism and Catholicism, and so we're in the Via Media, we call it. And it's like, if you think about the early Christian texts, way before we had Constantine and the Nicene Creed, and it became a doctrinal church and was co-opted by the empire and all those things. The teacher said, follow me. Never said worship me. Never wrote a book with any rules and regulations, just build a community. So if you go back to the earliest community, it wasn't about, the word pistuin in Greek is a verb. It's translated belief. It means more faith, the kind of faith is trust. And it's an action verb. So believing for, like in the Gospel of John, is loving God and loving, as a neighbor as thyself, and practicing compassion and walking in this way. And Christians were called the way. It was a way of life. So how do we reclaim that when there's so much, 2,000 years of focus on some things you have to assent to in order to be saved? And also, there are other strands of Christianity that focus far more on our original blessedness. Don't even have original sin in their language, and where do we get that? So these are things that we wrestle with right now, and it's important to not express these ideas about Christianity in a way that's judgmental and punishing and accusative, but these ways of understanding Christianity need to be expressed, because sin and other countries have religions that are taking the religion in the wrong direction, fundamentalist directions that are exploiting people, and it just so happens in this country, Christianity is being used as a tool. And so it's up to us who are Christians, who understand the teachings differently, read the Hebrew and the Greek, and read all the stories of Jesus' life backward and forward, to say, no. So our images of God, our language for God, has a lot to do with how we, a cool God maketh a cool man. So we also need to reframe our language for God. Patriarchal, dominating, authoritative, punishing. And that's, you can find those words in the Bible, but there are so many others. Source of all life, the feminine words for God, neutral, and so I guess I'm rambling on, but we're talking about God. Does God exist? Does God not exist? I sometimes don't even want to use the word God. In ancient Hebrew, you didn't say the word God. And so I think maybe we need to understand, be careful.
Yeah, I think it's okay that there's monotheistic approaches and I don't want to, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here, right? I think there's something very valuable about the fact that some traditions are monotheistic, and so they have a singularity versus a multiplicity, right? And that there's some that are organized linearly, where there's a person who leads a following versus multiple. I want to be careful to not just completely throw that out, right? So.
Phil?
I want to come back to what Alan was saying. And it reminded me so much of why Christmas was founded in the first place by Nancy Milner in the early 90s. Nancy Milner was a cross between a pioneer and a rebel. And the things that you said about how Christianity has been, how the basic teachings of Christianity have been institutionalized in ways that have a political element to it, was what she found so discouraging. And she wanted to create an organization where people would have these kinds of conversations that kept pushing the boundaries of traditional Christianity. I mean, that's what was her orientation. And that's the history of this organization that is now called Innerwork. So thank you for saying that.
Yes.
I wanted to go back to the practice thing.
So that was a question on my list, so let's go back to that. So the question we had was, what are the practices for inner work in your tradition? Is that?
That's exactly
Yeah.
what I mean. Because I don't want to talk about belief or faith or nothing.
I get it. Does anybody want to start that conversation? Come on.
Yeah, so in Islam we have the 5 pillars. The first one is the declaration of faith, the second one is the 5 daily prayers, then the fasting in Ramadan, giving the alms to the poor, and then the 5th one is the pilgrimage to Mecca, which we're supposed to do only once in a lifetime if we can afford it and are physically able to. So I was looking at those 5 pillars, and all of them kind of help us with inner work, but I think the ones that help the most probably are the 5 daily prayers, the fasting of Ramadan, and the pilgrimage, the Hajj. So the 5 daily prayers, it's a time to basically turn inward, because we have to take time out of our busy schedule every day, whether we are at work or at school. We have to find a quiet place and just stand there for 5 minutes, do the standing and the bowing and the prostrating concentration and think about God rather than about our busy lives. And that's very good and very centering and very grounding and very soothing to the soul. And then the fasting is for an entire month, but of course we eat in the evening. So the fasting actually makes the heart lighter because we are dual beings. We are spiritual and physical at the same time. And in Ramadan, we try to give more weight to the spiritual side than to the physical side. So we try to neglect the physical side and focus on the spiritual. So during the day, and honestly, everybody, when Ramadan comes around, everybody says, oh my God, you can't eat for an entire, 15 hours, 16 hours. I'm like, I really don't miss it. The first day you get a little bit hungry, the second day, third day, no hunger at all. The hunger goes away. Seriously, your body retrains itself. And then you have a lot more time and energy to focus on the important things in life. And it's a magnificent experience. And then the third one, the Hajj, the pilgrimage, which we do once in our lifetime, it's basically following the rituals of Prophet Abraham and his wife Hagar, and how he took her out into the desert and left her there in a place that was desolate desert. There was no water, no food, nothing. But she trusted in God, and she kept going between two hills to find water. And he basically went back to where he came from and left her there with a baby. And she did not despair. She was a very strong woman, and she just kept looking for water until God sent an angel to give her water from basically this miraculous well came up from the ground. And when we go to Hajj, I haven't been lucky enough to go yet, but I really look forward to it. We meet Muslims from all corners of the world. We meet Chinese Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, European Muslims, Arab Muslims, all kinds of Muslims from Burma, from, all kinds of places that you haven't even heard of. And we're all together, and it's like a rehearsal for the Day of Judgment. And remember when I said that accountability is very important in Islam? So we're all there, and we're all dressed, especially the men, they have to dress in this white cloth, which is like a shroud, like the shroud that when we die, we are shrouded in a white cloth. And so we're there, we're all just asking God for the same thing. We're asking Him for mercy and forgiveness. And it's just like a rehearsal for the Day of Judgment, and for Judgment Day. And it's about putting life in perspective, putting things in perspective, going back home and realizing there's more to life than just running after money or after possessions, getting a new car, buying a bigger house. There's more to life than that. And it's a wonderful experience. So
Candy, can you speak to some of the rituals for Innerwork?
Yeah, I think from one perspective, every practice in Judaism is a means of inner work. Jewish religious life is governed by what are traditionally translated as commandments. Mitzvot, mitzvah is the singular Hebrew word, that really kind of structure every aspect of a traditionally observant Jew's life. But there's this sort of etymology that is sometimes given to this word mitzvah, commandment. It's probably from an actual academic perspective, it's a false etymology, but that doesn't matter. Which sees this word mitzvah as coming from the Aramaic word savta, which means connection. And so this tradition says that every commandment, no matter how seemingly ritualistic or whatever, is a means of connection with God. But there are also, a lot of practices that are not considered kind of normative commandments that certain people take on that I think would definitely fall into this inner work category. A lot of these involve additional prayers and kind of penitential prayers and certain specialized liturgies that people do. already in traditional normative Judaism, there are people pray 3 times a day. But even within that, which I think is in certain ways very clearly an inner work practice of transformation, right? One of the Hebrew phrases that's repeated in the liturgy, the traditional liturgy, Taher libenu la'avdecha be'emet, to purify our hearts to serve you in truth. But I think prayer is a really striking example, again, of this kind of lack of a distinction between inner and outer. It makes me think again of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I mentioned earlier, who was very involved in civil rights and anti-Vietnam War activism, and he was asked by a journalist once at an anti-Vietnam War rally, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because I can't pray." And this journalist said, "What does that mean? Why are you here because you can't pray?" "Yeah, because every time I try to pray, I see images of children burned from napalm. And so my prayers are impossible unless I am here."
Unless I
Am here. He said, "Yeah, I'm rambling a little bit now," but he was invited by President Kennedy to a White House summit on religion and race, and he sent back this telegram, which is I think just this incredible document. Of course, this was 60 years ago, so the language is dated now. But what the exact quote he said in the telegram is, "We forfeit right to worship God as long as we humiliate Negroes." And so I think it's just, for me, a really powerful example of the inner and the outer being seamless. The most profound inner practice of devotional prayer can't be separated from what's going on in the world.
Interesting. Emily, you spoke a little bit about some of the practices in Christianity, prayer, contemplative.
Yes, and of course, since we're so closely aligned in so many of our liturgical practices and commandments like the Sabbath. So when I was hearing what you were saying, Sabbath rest is not optional. It's right there with none of the other commandments. So that is a practice for stillness. It's a cessation. It's like a sentence is a run-on sentence unless you punctuate it. But it's also a time where, for stillness, where you then see truth that you're ignoring, and seeing the truth leads to action. So there's balance between the contemplation and the action. So other practices are, we do have liturgical seasons, such as the season of Lent, which is when we enact a wilderness time, 40 days in the wilderness, 40 days in Jesus, we're out in the desert, and it's a time of prayer and fasting, reflection on sacred texts. So those are sort of more well-known practices in Christianity. We also have a daily office where there's 4 times of prayer and monastic traditions, and people practice that in my tradition, and some don't so much. More recently, we've embraced traditions like contemplative prayer, praying with prayer beads, praying with the rosary, walking the labyrinth, which is an inward and outward journey, just doing it. It's embodied. You go inward and then you walk outward. So I feel like this inner work we're talking about, it's always the inner work leads to the outer work. And then Lectio Divina, which is a reading of sacred reading. So you'll reflect on a passage of scripture or a sacred text, not for knowledge, but for connection with it and experience of insight or revelation. And then another is the tradition of spiritual direction. The Anankara, the soul friend, and Anglicanism has a lot of connection to the Celtic practices. So that is when you do have a guide who will listen and help you discern God's presence in your life. And so, we talked a lot about I said earlier, the presence of God. And I think one thing I'd like to say is, in practicing the presence of God, we have to also acknowledge that God is present out there long before our arrival on the scene. So everywhere we go is an opportunity to see the presence of God, and that takes some humility. So I'm complete with that.
did you have some?
Yeah, and I just want to say I interpreted the question very literally. So when I thought of inner work, I thought of that which one does with oneself, right? So there's a bunch of different paths to the inner work of achieving moksha that have to do with doing for others. So seva, which is service and things like that, they all exist, right? They all ultimately lead to the inner work of moksha. But I took it very literally. So I have two particular things in the Hindu practice that I want to talk about. One is Maun, which is silence, and the other is Dhyan Yoga, which is contemplation or reflection. Maun is the sacred practice of inner peace, quietude, and self-control. It is quite literally to not speak, but it is about holding the body still. So my grandmother, rest her soul, bless her heart, acted in Maun but didn't practice it because while her words didn't come out of her mouth, her whole body told us a lot. Literally, there were times where she would get frustrated enough that she would write a note. And I was that grandchild. I was like, is that really Maun? With all that attitude. Like just exactly like that. Didn't win me any points. So the idea is that one is silent, that silence is necessary for divine communion, right? And Maun, so like I also experience it and understand it. So as someone who writes, it's also for me this idea of the emptying out of my monkey mind, to use the Buddhist phrase, right? Where it gets quiet enough that I can hear the voice. That voice of the divine that tells me this is what you're going to say. Because for me, my writing practice is a divine practice, right? And so, like teaching and all of that is part of my calling. And so that's Maun. The other is Dhyan. And Dhyan is the practice that's used to achieve self-knowledge and samadhi. And samadhi is when your mind detaches from the body. And so people realize souls who sit in samadhi, literally their body just, it's like they go into a trance state because they are communing with Brahma. So their soul is communing, their self is communing with Brahma, the body is just sitting there, it's a shadow. So Dhyan comes from the Sanskrit word dhi, which means mind, and jnana, which means movement. So it's considered, in the Bhagavad Gita, Dhyan Yoga is one of the 4 yogic disciplines. So Dhyan Yoga, knowledge, the way of knowledge. Karma Yoga, the way of action, doing, right? Bhakti, which is prayer, the way of prayer, right? And so it's the process of observing the movement of thoughts that enter and leave the mind while remaining silent, stable, and detached. And very quick story. I think one of the most profound practices of Dhyan Yoga I ever saw. It's done to break old samskara, right? Samskara is that attachment to the cycle of life and birth. So you want to detach yourself from that. But we're in a human limited body. And so the most profound practice of Dhyan Yoga that I ever experienced was when a person that my father and I would consider a guru came to our house and came from India. We hadn't seen him in maybe a decade. And he was telling us the story of his son dying. And his son died tragically, had a massive heart attack suddenly. He was young, he was in his 40s. And I watched him tell the story. His voice didn't shake. There was deep compassion. So there wasn't an absence of emotion, right? But I didn't see, like, he wasn't a father, like, the way you would think a father's voice would be, right? Telling the story, like, that wasn't in his voice at all. But if you looked at him, tears were pouring down his face. So he was still and steady in the thoughts and the emotions that were moving through his body, right? And I watched that and I thought, this is Dhyan. This is Dhyan Yoga, where he was like, my body and my attached self is experiencing the loss of my child yet again, and I am one with God. right? And so it is a moment. This is where I think Hinduism separated a little bit around suffering, where it's not about there is suffering and our job is to find a way to end it. Hinduism would say there is suffering just as there is joy, both are impermanent. Right? And so that's kind of like if you're having laughter, because something beautiful is happening, you laugh, but are you steady? If you let the roller coaster go up, the roller coaster will go down, and that's the body experience. Where is your mind? So those are the two I would say.
Jay?
Yeah, so it really relates to the other. So in Buddhism, the traditional saying is there's 84,000 dharma doors or 84,000 teachings. So, which is just almost infinite number of practices that are consistent with Buddhism or that the Buddha taught, depending on what tradition you're speaking to. But when the other question you have written on here, what are the goals of inner work in your tradition? That really shapes what specific practices. So the ultimate goal is liberation, release from suffering, release from the cycle of samsara or nirvana. But that's only for very few this lifetime. We all will get there. That's the beauty of infinite time and reincarnation. So we don't have to work it out this time. So most of us don't. Because that's a really high bar. And so the practices for that are really hard. But like deep meditative absorption and ridiculous amounts of compassion and stuff. But for most of us, or most Buddhists, we are so trapped in what we do. So what makes you a Buddhist is to take refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and then take the Uposatha vows, which was a commitment to non-stealing, sexual restraint, no intoxication, non-harming, no lying. Which we fail at every day, all the time. And so you just have to counteract that stuff, some of which can be done through meditation and chanting and these other practices. But a lot of it are done through just accruing good karma, again, by selfless service or lighting lamps, praying to a deity, serving the monks, the ones that are on that path, because it'll be your turn, maybe not next time or the time after that, but even at some point in the future, that you'll need that. So those are a lot of, in more heritage Buddhist traditions, that's what those inner work practices are, taking that time out, like there's the equivalent of priesters or high holiday Jewish people in Buddhism do. That's like you go to the temple on these specific days, you do your little things, but the better ones mark that out as, again, a special time, that this is where we work on this stuff, and then we go back to being a butcher or whatever that proves terribly fun. And maybe we meditate ritually and fall asleep, but it all counts as inner work. Every little drip, drop, drip, even those mundane, silly things. You don't.
Jay, that's a perfect place to transition.
Oh, sorry.
It all counts as inner work. I just want to be sensitive of the time. Get up.
I just want to it's a quick question.
Okay.
So my question is, I sit here and listen to all of this and think about this center, and I'm being quite selfish with my role and the staff and our wonderful board and supporters and community that's all here, is where is the common ground in inner work that is free from a religious track that an organization like ours can provide a space for people to come to? We're not in the lane of each religion, and yet we want to be cafeteria style and open to the seekers as Nancy, our founder, created us to be. Where is the common ground amongst everything that we've said tonight, and when you say one word, because I know we're coming up on time, is there one word that you might share with us to begin to envision what this space can become for
So
people?
that's exactly how I was going to close. I was going to start with the
Well,
audience.
there,
So one word. You all have a little bit more time to think about your one word, but I'm going to start in the back. And just one word of how can we find common ground in your work?
Silence.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, curiosity.
Sarah?
Stardust.
And Chris?
Curiosity.
Humility.
Community.
Belonging. Questions?
Vision. Hearing. Openness.
Meditation.
Diligence.
Honoring. Yearning.
Cultivating our capacity, being aware of what we are aware of.
There's always somebody that has to break the rules.
Which one, sir?
Sensitivity to all of it. Yeah, like that. Unity.
Friendship. I'll do 2 words, less complicated.
A wonderful panel.
Open-heartedness.
Compassion.
Vulnerability.
Plurality. So many paths.
So this last person on the list, no. I would, the interesting question there is, what it made me think of is, don't think of it as trying to get the common ground between traditions, but actually don't try to bracket out the religions. Do exactly like this, like lean in to the traditions together.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, like when I said plurality, it's like so many different ways.
Yeah,
Or don't.
embrace the. Thank you, everybody. Felicia, do we have a little closing? Don't go anywhere yet. Can I Yana, could you come to the front? Yes.
I wanted to just share something briefly from one of our books in the Bible, the book of Job, which is a part of our wisdom literature. I haven't heard a lot about our raising questions. And one of the things that's so intriguing about the book of Job is that Job asked God, after his list of losses, Job asked God 160 plus questions. And when God came to Job, God didn't answer a single question, but instead he questioned Job or raised 80 questions with Job. But here was Job's declaration that God, I've searched for you everywhere, north, east, south, west. I couldn't find you. And then it was kind of like, oops, I could have had a day. I don't know where you are, but you know right where I am. And that's the book of Job. And as it gets to the end after God finishes his questioning of Job, Job declares, God, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear. But now, I see you with my own eyes. That's the summation of, in my opinion, for what you all have shared today.
And today we're celebrating not only all these wonderful wisdom traditions, but our fearless leader's birthday.
This is
so
happy
funny.
birthday. Happy
Okay.
birthday.
Okay.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Yana. Happy birthday to you.
I have to tell you all that this is really comical because I was raised Jehovah's Witness. So if you don't know what that means, I've never had a birthday party or Christmas morning. I wasn't allowed to go to any parties or holidays. And many of you know my story, but I sat literally every morning outside in the hall in the classroom because I couldn't do the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I could never celebrate parties. So I am really excited to find my lane in this role because I've sat outside and watched all the religions and all the parties and have traveled the world and practiced every single religion that's on the stage up here. And the question for us for inner work is a really exciting question, and I so appreciate your answer at the end to think of another way to engage around this. So it's wonderful to be honored, and I love it. And at the same time, it seems like it was always meant to be that way for me, so that I could see the bigger picture, if you will. And that's what I hope that we can do with this space. And I loved your idea. We should do more of this because the inclusivity of all of it is what really is the inner work. Yeah. So thank you for the flowers and the cake.
You're dismissed.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you very much. Appreciate
Beautifully done as usual. You're the ultimate moderator. Well, 5 people in an hour and a half. Thank you. Thursday meditation group, and he showed up in time. And